The St. Francis Dam, completed in the mid-1920s under the supervision of Chief Engineer William Mulholland, was conceived as a gravity arch concrete structure intended to provide a stable holding reservoir for Los Angeles's growing water supply needs. The facility was located in San Francisco Canyon, a semi-arid tributary valley north of Los Angeles, where the topography presented a narrow constriction formed by a natural spur of bedrock on the western side and an elevated eastern abutment of schist. The design of the dam drew heavily on precedent from the recently completed Hollywood Dam, replicating its mass concrete form and curvature without conducting formalized site-specific structural calculations. The primary design premise relied on the inherent weight of the concrete to counteract hydrostatic forces from the impounded water, with the assumption that the abutment bedrock could adequately transmit load and maintain stability under static and slowly rising reservoir conditions. Construction began in 1924 with an initial design height of 56 meters, which was later increased by 6 meters through a vertical extension at the crest, bringing the total height to 62 meters. This modification increased the horizontal stress at the base and reduced the overall factor of safety with respect to both sliding and rotational stability. Foundation preparation involved excavation of weathered rock to varying depths of 1 to 4 meters, with a cut-off trench intended to function as a shear key under the upstream wall. Drainage provisions consisted of relief wells primarily located beneath the central section of the dam. These did not extend beneath the abutments. Notably, there was no internal inspection gallery or drainage tunnel, and no grout curtain was installed beneath the dam to control seepage. The decision to limit drainage measures rested on the presumption that the abutment rock was sufficiently homogeneous and competent to resist hydrostatic uplift pressures, despite contemporary geotechnical knowledge suggesting the importance of comprehensive drainage under such conditions. The eastern abutment consisted of Pelona schist, a metamorphic rock with pervasive schistosity, cross fractures, and planes of weakness aligned nearly parallel to the valley slope. Historical surveys of the area had documented this rock as prone to sliding along its foliation and fracture planes, and an ancient landslide was known to occupy the lower portion of the slope. The western abutment rested on Vasquez conglomerate, a clay-rich sedimentary rock with low unconfined compressive strength, high susceptibility to swelling, and dissolution potential under water exposure. These heterogeneous geological conditions introduced a fundamental asymmetry in the foundation's ability to support the dam. The original design premise assumed uniform, competent abutments which did not account for differential deformation, uplift pressures, or weak plane failure within the underlying schist or conglomerate. Instrumentation and monitoring were minimal and indirect, consistent with early 20th century civil engineering practices. Surface cracks in the downstream concrete face were considered normative for mass concrete, and seepage through the abutments, including flows intersecting the San Francisco Fault, was observed but interpreted within the framework of expected reservoir saturation behavior. No instrumentation existed to directly measure uplift pressures beneath the abutments, and surface indicators provided a misleadingly stable picture of the dam's true structural state. The system, as perceived by the engineers and operators, presented a visual and quantitative baseline that suggested normalcy, even though the underlying materials were responding differently to the applied loads and water pressure. The interaction of the design assumptions with the geological realities created latent vulnerabilities. The gravity arch design assumed that increasing height and reservoir loading could be resisted by the weight of the concrete alone. However, the asymmetric foundation conditions, compounded by insufficient drainage and incomplete foundation excavation, meant that uplift pressures beneath the eastern schist abutment and potential piping within the western conglomerate were neither observed directly nor anticipated. The reliance on surface cracking and seepage as indicators of stability, coupled with authority-driven construction decisions, created an operational model where the system appeared consistent with design even as it approached critical stress conditions. The conceptual integrity of the dam's operating state was therefore contingent on geological assumptions that were demonstrably invalid under the actual site conditions. The central operational assumption, mass concrete resisting hydrostatic load while abutments remained rigid, also informed procedural expectations during reservoir filling. Engineers expected that the dam would respond predictably to incremental water level increases and that surface observations would be sufficient to detect deviations requiring corrective measures. Relief well drainage in the central section was presumed adequate for the entire structure, and any minor seepage or cracking was interpreted as within safe bounds. These procedural expectations reflected the mental model of the system, a uniform, well-founded concrete barrier in which any deviations from baseline could be interpreted as non-critical or manageable through standard observation. The actual physical system, however, included multiple failure pathways in the form of uplift-induced sliding in the schist, consolidation and piping in the conglomerate, and the potential for mobilization of the ancient landslide within the eastern abutment. The cumulative effect of these conditions established a deterministic pathway to structural compromise. The design's reliance on a single corrective weight-based mechanism, combined with incomplete understanding of site geology, uninstrumented uplift, and non-redundant drainage, meant that minor deviations during reservoir filling could initiate progressive destabilization. Importantly, all monitoring cues were consistent with historical expectations. The instruments and visual inspections provided accurate readings in a technical sense, yet they were misleading in terms of the diagnostic validity necessary to identify impending failure. Thus, the dam could operate within normal observable parameters, while the internal system state approached irreversibility. In this context, the St. Francis Dam represented a complex interplay between design philosophy, human decision-making authority, and geotechnical uncertainty. The dam's apparent stability during incremental filling masked the underlying structural risks introduced by asymmetrical abutment properties and inadequate foundation treatment. Operators and engineers were constrained by prevailing practices and authority-driven design decisions, which assumed that visible cracking and limited seepage did not indicate significant danger. The foundational assumption that competent rock and central drainage were sufficient to maintain overall stability was violated by the heterogeneous conditions at the site. Consequently, the dam embodied a system whose observable state did not correspond to its true structural integrity, creating a latent path to failure that would only become apparent once external forces, principally hydrostatic uplift and landslide mobilization, exceeded the inadequate safety margins embedded within the design. This analysis identifies the critical structural assumptions: uniform, competent abutments, sufficiency of central drainage, predictability of mass concrete behavior under hydrostatic load, and the reliability of surface observation as a diagnostic tool. Each of these assumptions was technically rationalized at the time, but structurally contingent on conditions that were violated in situ. The stage was therefore set for a failure sequence in which observed indicators and procedural actions would be internally consistent with operator expectations, yet progressively ineffective at preventing catastrophic compromise. The physical system, driven by its own weight and water pressure, contained latent energy paths that could not be arrested by any procedural intervention grounded in the original mental model. In this respect, the St. Francis Dam's collapse was not a matter of chance or mismanagement, but the structural consequence of embedded design assumptions operating on a site whose properties invalidated them. The forensic implication is clear. The system was functionally deterministic in its failure once these assumptions were breached, even though monitoring and operator actions adhered entirely to contemporary standards. The central question emerging from this analysis is how a set of technically correct observations and operational procedures can create the illusion of stability while the system is, by its own physical and geological parameters, progressing toward unavoidable structural collapse. Following the initial filling of the St. Francis Dam, attention turned to the operational dynamics imposed by hydrostatic loading and the dam's interaction with its foundation and abutments. As the reservoir approached full capacity, engineers relied on incremental filling schedules designed to detect anomalies before critical thresholds were reached. These procedures, standard for the period, were grounded in the presumption that observable surface indicators, minor cracking, seepage stains, or slight shifts in concrete blocks, would provide sufficient early warning of structural compromise. Implicit in this approach was the assumption that the dam's response would remain within the elastic or near-elastic range, and that asymmetries in foundation stiffness would not translate into differential stress concentrations sufficient to propagate failure. Empirical observations during early impoundment cycles suggested the dam behaved normally. Downstream face cracks appeared along vertical and diagonal planes, but were interpreted as standard shrinkage and thermal contraction patterns common in mass concrete construction. Seepage along the eastern abutment and through minor fractures in the Polona schist was noted, yet these flows were comparatively modest, did not visibly erode the foundation, and were not perceived as indicative of large-scale instability. In the western abutment, percolation through the Vasquez conglomerate produced minor turbid flows that were dismissed as transient responses to reservoir elevation changes rather than harbingers of progressive internal erosion or piping. The engineering team led by Mulholland maintained a cognitive framework in which minor anomalies were inherently non-critical, reinforcing confidence in the structure's overall stability. However, underlying these operational perceptions were complex, interacting geomechanical processes. The Polona schist, with its pronounced foliation planes aligned nearly parallel to the valley slope, had limited shear resistance when subjected to lateral hydrostatic pressures. Progressive saturation from impounded water-induced creep and microsliding along these planes, generating gradual displacement at the base of the eastern abutment. This movement was subtle, occurring within the measurement noise of visual observation, and thus remained undetected in the absence of precise instrumentation. Concurrently, uplift pressures beneath the central mass of the dam were transmitted unevenly into the heterogeneous conglomerate of the western abutment. The combination of clay-rich matrix and jointed bedding promoted slow consolidation and seepage enlargement, creating discrete internal flow paths that, while initially minor, reduced basal friction and contributed to localized sliding potential. Operational procedures did not incorporate continuous or quantitative assessment of these geotechnical interactions. The monitoring framework assumed hydrostatic forces would be absorbed uniformly by the concrete mass and underlying rock, an assumption invalidated by the asymmetric foundation conditions. Any deviations from uniformity were interpreted through the lens of normative expectations. Slight seepage was acceptable, minor cracks were expected, and the dam's visual stability reinforced belief in its soundness. Thus, the organizational model conflated the system's observable performance with structural adequacy, a critical mismatch that effectively blinded operators to the progressive destabilization occurring at depth. Throughout this period, a critical human factor was the authority-driven confidence in design precedent. Mulholland's personal oversight and prior success with Hollywood Dam created a professional environment in which his judgment was rarely questioned. Engineering staff deferred to his assessments, and minor geotechnical uncertainties were subordinated to operational expedience. When reservoir levels rose more rapidly than anticipated due to seasonal inflows, adjustments were made within the existing procedural framework without re-evaluating the foundational assumptions. This embedded authority structure meant that risk perception was filtered through established mental models rather than derived from independent verification of material behavior or site-specific analyses. The incremental filling exposed further latent vulnerabilities. Even moderate increases in water level intensified uplift at the interface between the dam base and the underlying conglomerate. Laboratory analyses of Vasquez conglomerate later indicated low shear strength under saturated conditions, suggesting that incremental hydraulic loading could generate basal sliding along pre-existing weaknesses. The eastern abutment experienced similar stress evolution. Saturation of Polona schist foliation planes reduced frictional resistance while promoting rotational tendencies in the adjoining mass concrete. These processes were inherently time-dependent, progressing slowly and imperceptibly, yet their cumulative effect systematically eroded the dam's factor of safety. Importantly, no single observation, whether seepage measurement or visual inspection, directly contradicted operator expectations, maintaining the illusion of operational normalcy. The hydromechanical response of the dam also interacted with temperature-induced concrete behavior. Thermal contraction of mass concrete, particularly during nighttime cooling, contributed to microcracking along vertical joints. These cracks were superficial in appearance but served as conduits for water migration, facilitating localized seepage that could penetrate into underlying rock discontinuities. Once water entered these paths, hydraulic pressures within the rock matrix increased, amplifying stress on weak planes and exacerbating micro-movements along both abutments. This positive feedback loop, invisible to surface observation, progressively destabilized the foundation concrete system while maintaining a surface signature that conformed to the engineer's normative expectations. By mid-1928, operational logs reveal repeated entries of minor seepage and observable crack growth, yet these were consistently categorized as non-critical. The reasoning behind this classification rested on four assumptions. 1. Concrete mass was inherently stable under static and slowly varying hydrostatic loads. 2. Abutment rock could transmit load without significant deformation. 3. Minor surface cracks reflected thermal or shrinkage effects, not structural compromise. And 4. Relief wells provided adequate drainage to maintain global stability. All four assumptions were technically defensible, given the knowledge and practices of the era, but were structurally contingent on site conditions that were demonstrably violated. Thus, operator confidence remained high even as geotechnical processes were undermining the dam's integrity. An additional layer of complexity arose from the interactions between the reservoir and local seismicity. San Francisco Canyon, while not experiencing large earthquakes during this operational period, was intersected by minor fault lines and zones of fractured rock. Dynamic amplification of hydrostatic forces, even at low magnitudes, could exacerbate movements along schistosity planes and pre-existing shear surfaces in the conglomerate. These interactions were not considered in the design nor in operational assessments, leaving the system vulnerable to cumulative effects from minor disturbances. While no seismic event directly precipitated collapse, the system's sensitivity to such factors contributed to an intrinsic fragility that had gone unquantified and unmonitored. The procedural environment compounded this fragility. Reservoir filling schedules emphasized incremental observation, yet lacked protocols for independent geotechnical verification. There were no systematic measurements of uplift, pore pressure distribution, or abutment deformation beyond visual inspection. Consequently, any destabilizing processes occurring internally could proceed undetected for extended periods. Observed behaviors, such as minor crack propagation and seepage, were interpreted within an operational model that assumed uniform foundation competence. This interpretive framework rendered the system effectively blind to the pathways through which failure was progressing. A critical human decision during this period was the continuation of filling, despite observed seepage and crack propagation. Engineering judgment, informed by precedent and authority, deemed these phenomena within tolerable limits. Yet from a systems perspective, this decision imposed a deterministic trajectory toward failure. By relying solely on visual inspection and central drainage effectiveness, operators inadvertently allowed the dam to approach a hydromechanical state in which the factor of safety for abutment sliding and basal uplift approached unity. Each incremental increase in water height, while seemingly minor, added stored energy to weak planes and saturated rock, pushing the system closer to an irrecoverable configuration. The interplay between design assumptions, operational procedures, and geological reality during this period illustrates a recurring theme in engineering failure. Structurally plausible decisions can generate latent failure pathways if assumptions are misaligned with actual site conditions. In the case of the St. Francis Dam, the decision to treat minor cracks and seepage as non-critical, combined with incremental filling and reliance on limited drainage, created a system state in which multiple failure modes were simultaneously approaching activation thresholds. These modes included sliding along schist foliation planes, basal uplift-induced rotation, internal piping within conglomerate, and potential mobilization of ancient landslide material, all occurring without clear warning at the surface. The evolving system understanding, informed by both operational logs and subsequent forensic analysis, demonstrates the divergence between perceived and actual stability. Operators acted logically based on their observations and the engineering knowledge of the time. Yet the physical system was simultaneously moving toward a multimodal failure state, highlighting the inherent risk in equating surface indicators with structural sufficiency in heterogeneous geotechnical conditions. The St. Francis Dam thus exemplifies a scenario in which incremental, authority-approved operational decisions, when combined with unrecognized site-specific vulnerabilities, create a deterministic pathway to catastrophic collapse. The hydrostatic pressures at the base of the dam had been gradually increasing with successive reservoir fills. Engineering calculations at the time, primarily based on gravity dam theory and precedent from other mass concrete structures, assumed that the abutments would remain essentially rigid and that load transmission into the foundation would be evenly distributed. This assumption, however, was invalidated by the highly heterogeneous nature of the site geology. The Pelona schist of the eastern abutment exhibited pervasive foliation plains, sub-horizontal shear zones, and localized weathered zones that reduced its shear strength. Laboratory testing, conducted post-collapse, indicated that saturated schist could sustain only a fraction of the lateral forces predicted under the original design assumptions. Concurrently, the Vasquez conglomerate of the western abutment, composed of clay-rich layers and water-soluble constituents, displayed low unconfined compressive strength and high susceptibility to consolidation under repeated loading. As water levels rose incrementally, both abutments began to deform in ways that were imperceptible at the surface. Microsliding along schist foliation planes initiated slight rotational movement of the concrete mass near the eastern abutment. The conglomerate on the western side underwent minor consolidation and internal piping, leading to localized reductions in basal friction. These deformations were below the detection threshold of surface monitoring techniques available at the time. Visual inspections continued to report the dam as stable, and minor seepage was recorded but interpreted as within tolerable limits. Here, the interaction between hidden geotechnical processes and observational procedures created a false sense of security. The dam's observable state appeared consistent with expectations, yet internal stresses were approaching critical levels. Instrumentation at the time was rudimentary. Relief wells were concentrated beneath the central portion of the dam, and no systematic measurement of uplift pressures under the abutments existed. Cracks in the downstream face were logged, but these were considered typical of thermal and shrinkage effects in mass concrete. The absence of internal galleries or instrumentation to measure subsurface water pressures meant that the engineering team was effectively blind to the progressive loading of weak zones within the foundation. Consequently, operational decisions were made under the assumption that the dam's response, as observed externally, accurately reflected the internal structural state. This assumption would prove catastrophically incorrect. Hydromechanical interactions played a critical role during this period. Seepage through the western conglomerate, initially minor, began to enlarge fissures and create preferential flow paths. This process initiated internal piping, where water movement progressively removed fines from clay-rich layers, reducing effective stress and basal shear resistance. On the eastern side, saturation of schist foliation planes reduced interlayer friction, allowing micro-rotational movement. The combination of these processes created an asymmetric stress distribution in the concrete mass. Lateral resistance on the eastern abutment decreased while uplift on the western abutment increased. This asymmetry directly conflicted with the design assumption of uniform load transfer and rigid abutment support. The gravity arch concept relies on a combination of arch action, self-weight, and friction at the foundation to resist hydrostatic pressures. If one abutment weakens, the arch action becomes unbalanced, concentrating stresses in zones not intended to carry such loads. In the St. Francis Dam, the gradual weakening of the eastern and western abutments produced precisely this scenario. Stress concentrations developed at mid-height sections of the dam, increasing the potential for sliding, rotation, or tensile cracking. Importantly, these conditions were not evident from surface inspections. Operational logs from the period indicate repeated observations of minor seepage and superficial cracking. with comments characterizing these as non-critical. For instance, seepage along the eastern abutment was described as slight and consistent with prior readings. Cracks on the downstream face, particularly along vertical joints, were logged but attributed to concrete shrinkage and thermal effects. Each entry reinforced the mental model that the dam was performing as expected. From a human factors perspective, this illustrates a classic confirmation bias. Engineers and operators filtered observations through a lens shaped by prior success and authority, thereby underweighting subtle indicators of geotechnical compromise. The decision-making framework also emphasized continuity over recalibration. Once reservoir filling procedures were established, and the structure was observed to respond normally, deviations were interpreted conservatively. No extraordinary investigative measures were implemented to assess subsurface conditions, despite repeated seepage reports. The belief in the sufficiency of central drainage and the competence of abutment rock constrained the range of considered responses. Any recommendation for additional drainage measures, excavation, or structural reinforcement was effectively ruled out by the embedded assumption that the system was fundamentally sound. This organizational mindset exemplifies a key failure of institutional design. When operational confidence is tied to authority and precedent, subtle but structurally significant signals can be systematically discounted. The evolving stress state of the dam was further influenced by hydrological variability. Seasonal rainfall events contributed additional hydrostatic load, while variations in water temperature induced minor thermal expansion and contraction cycles. These effects were small in magnitude, but had the cumulative effect of modulating micro-stresses at critical interfaces. In particular, minor thermal cycling could open and close micro-cracks along foliation planes and joints in the conglomerate, promoting seepage and the progressive migration of fines. Such time-dependent processes were not incorporated into contemporary design calculations, leaving the dam vulnerable to gradual, unobserved weakening over months of operation. Post-incident forensic analysis revealed that the eastern abutment's schist had developed measurable displacement and rotation, while the western conglomerate exhibited localized zones of basal erosion and reduced shear resistance. These findings confirm that failure mechanisms were initiated well before the dramatic collapse, occurring incrementally under conditions considered acceptable at the time. In effect, the dam had entered a critical pre-failure state, the factor of safety. Although still nominally above unity according to contemporary calculations, had been eroded by unrecognized geotechnical processes, leaving the system highly sensitive to incremental load increases. Another contributing factor was the interdependence of failure modes. Uplift-induced rotation on one abutment increased stress on the opposite abutment, which was simultaneously undergoing basal weakening. This coupling created a positive feedback loop. Deformation on one side accelerated instability on the other. Such interactions were not considered in original design logic, which treated abutment behavior as independent and uniform. By the time the dam approached full reservoir level, these coupled mechanisms had created a near-critical system state in which a relatively minor perturbation, such as an additional water inflow or localized increase in seepage, could trigger full-scale failure. The human factor dimension also intensified the system's vulnerability. Engineering staff were conditioned to expect predictable responses based on precedent, and authority structures reinforced confidence in initial design assumptions. Warnings embedded in the data, such as incremental increases in seepage and widening cracks, were perceived as routine rather than extraordinary. Cognitive inertia, combined with limited observational instrumentation, prevented timely re-evaluation of the dam's structural integrity. Even where observations were quantitatively inconsistent with prior expectations, these inconsistencies were rationalized within existing operational mental models rather than prompting systemic analysis or corrective action. This stage in the dam's operational history demonstrates the interplay between design assumptions, site heterogeneity, and organizational dynamics. The gravity arch structure, when considered in isolation, appeared technically sound. Yet the combination of asymmetric abutment behavior, inadequate drainage, incremental hydrostatic loading, and reliance on superficial observation created a system in which failure pathways were both latent and deterministic. The operational model, observation-driven, authority-mediated, and assumption-dependent, failed to capture the true physical state of the structure, illustrating the gap between perceived and actual stability. Furthermore, the analysis highlights the importance of redundancy in monitoring and the limitations of visual inspection alone. Surface indicators provided a partially accurate but incomplete picture. Without instrumentation capable of measuring uplift pressures, abutment displacement, or internal seepage dynamics, the engineering team was effectively blind to processes occurring within the foundation. The resulting mismatch between monitoring capability and system complexity constitutes a core lesson in forensic engineering. The absence of overt anomalies does not equate to structural safety when latent pathways to failure exist. In summary, during the period leading up to late 1928, the St. Francis Dam operated in a pre-failure state characterized by subtle but progressive geotechnical deterioration. The interplay between hydrostatic pressure, foundation heterogeneity, and operational decision-making created multiple interacting failure modes that were unobservable within existing monitoring frameworks. The design assumptions, uniform abutment competence, adequacy of central drainage, predictability of concrete response, were increasingly violated, yet procedural adherence and authority-driven judgment masked the true risk. The dam's apparent stability was therefore a misrepresentation of its underlying physical condition, setting the stage for catastrophic collapse once external or internal perturbations exceeded the eroding safety margins. This chapter establishes the critical concept that structurally sound decisions, made in accordance with contemporary engineering knowledge and standard operating procedures, can inadvertently guide a system toward irreversible failure when foundational assumptions are incompatible with actual site conditions. It also demonstrates the compounding effect of latent geotechnical processes, human cognitive biases, and incomplete instrumentation on the evolution of system risk, underscoring the deterministic nature of the pathway toward structural collapse. As the St. Francis Dam approached its final operational phase, the focus of analysis shifts to the interplay between observed anomalies, human decision-making, and the progressive activation of latent failure mechanisms. The preceding chapters established the foundational context, a gravity arch dam designed under assumptions of uniform abutment competence, sufficient central drainage, and the predictability of mass concrete behavior under hydrostatic load. By this stage, these assumptions were increasingly misaligned with the actual geotechnical and hydromechanical realities of San Francisco Canyon. The convergence of multiple minor deviations, each individually interpreted as non-critical, set the system on an irreversible trajectory toward catastrophic failure. Reservoir management logs from early 1928 indicate incremental adjustments to water levels in response to seasonal inflows. The dam operators, following established protocols, considered these adjustments within the design envelope. Minor seepage flows were documented, yet consistently characterized as within normal parameters. Surface cracks, including new fissures along the downstream face, were recorded but rationalized as thermal or shrinkage-related. Importantly, these records reflect a procedural mindset in which deviations were filtered through a cognitive framework that emphasized conformity with precedent rather than active reevaluation of structural assumptions. Authority-driven operational culture reinforced confidence in prior design judgments, effectively insulating decision-makers from acknowledging the potential severity of emerging anomalies. Concurrently, the geotechnical and hydromechanical processes identified in previous chapters continued to progress imperceptibly. The Pelona schist of the eastern abutment underwent incremental shear displacement along foliation planes. Laboratory reconstruction suggests that saturation-induced reduction in interlayer friction exceeded the threshold required for micro-rotational movement of the adjacent concrete mass. On the western side, the Vasquez conglomerate experienced basal consolidation and localized piping, with fine particles transported through micro-fractures under elevated uplift pressures. The asymmetry of foundation response created an imbalance in stress distribution, concentrating tensile and shear forces in regions of the dam that were structurally unprepared to accommodate them. These interactions, occurring at depths and scales beyond observational capacity, constituted the latent activation of multiple failure modes. The interaction between hydrostatic load and foundation heterogeneity can be quantified using classical soil structure interaction principles. Uplift pressures beneath the dam are transmitted unevenly due to variability in permeability and stiffness of foundation materials. On the eastern side, reduced shear resistance in the schist allowed for partial rotation, transferring additional horizontal stress to mid-height sections of the dam. On the western side, seepage-driven erosion within the conglomerate decreased basal friction, further amplifying rotational tendencies. The result was a coupled system in which deformation in one abutment accelerated stress accumulation in the other. This positive feedback loop exemplifies a critical aspect of failure evolution. Interaction effects can rapidly transform nominally stable conditions into a deterministic pathway to collapse, even under routine operational loads. Instrumentation limitations significantly constrained operational awareness. Relief wells were concentrated under the central dam section, providing partial but incomplete measurement of uplift pressures. No subsurface galleries or piezometers were installed to capture localized hydraulic conditions beneath the abutments. Surface cracking and seepage flows, while visible, offered only a superficial understanding of the evolving stress state. From a forensic perspective, this represents a classic diagnostic gap. Accurate measurements were available where they were least informative, while critical stress pathways remained unmonitored. Operators, interpreting observable indicators as reliable, continued to operate the dam under the assumption that these readings reflected global stability. Hydrological variability added another dimension of complexity. Seasonal rainfall events and minor storm inflows increased reservoir levels temporarily, while diurnal and seasonal temperature fluctuations induced thermal expansion and contraction in mass concrete. These cycles promoted incremental crack propagation, allowing seepage to penetrate microfractures and reach underlying rock discontinuities. Once water entered these pathways, hydraulic pressures increased, progressively reducing shear strength and initiating localized failure mechanisms. Critically, these processes were cumulative and time-dependent, reinforcing the importance of continuous monitoring and the insufficiency of intermittent surface inspection. Human factors played a decisive role in shaping system response during this period. Mulholland's authority and prior success with large-scale water infrastructure created an environment in which engineering staff deferred to established judgment. When minor anomalies were observed, the default interpretation aligned with prior experience. Cracks were normal, seepage was tolerable, and foundation competence was assumed. This reliance on authority and precedent illustrates a systemic cognitive bias, wherein data inconsistent with mental models is discounted or reinterpreted to fit expectations. Consequently, the operator's situational awareness was inherently constrained, leaving them unprepared to identify the underlying structural instability. Operational decisions, while procedurally logical, increasingly imposed deterministic stress trajectories. Incremental filling schedules designed to detect anomalies were implemented under the assumption of uniform abutment behavior. Minor seepage and cracking, interpreted as non-critical, were insufficiently addressed through corrective measures. The reliance on central drainage, assumed to be adequate for the entire structure, failed to account for lateral flow paths in heterogeneous foundation materials. Each incremental water level adjustment added stored elastic and gravitational energy to zones of reduced structural capacity, pushing the system closer to critical thresholds. From a geotechnical perspective, failure potential was amplified by coupled interactions between abutments and reservoir load. Uplift-induced rotation on the eastern abutment increased stress on the western abutment, while basal weakening in the conglomerate reciprocally increased lateral stress in the east. These interdependent mechanisms created a state in which small perturbations, such as minor inflow or localized seepage, could trigger cascading failure. Importantly, these interactions were not evident from external inspection, reinforcing operator confidence even as the system approached instability. Procedural frameworks contributed to the deterministic pathway by emphasizing adherence to established observation schedules over active structural reassessment. The lack of systematic geotechnical measurement, no uplift monitoring under abutments, no pore pressure evaluation, no deformation mapping, meant that operators were unaware of the progressive erosion of safety margins. In essence, operational procedures were optimized for a system operating under initial assumptions, not for one experiencing evolving asymmetrical foundation behavior. This misalignment between procedural design and system reality exemplifies how technically sound operational decisions can inadvertently accelerate failure when assumptions are violated. The dam's pre-failure state during this period illustrates a convergence of multiple failure mechanisms: rotational instability of the concrete mass due to schist foliation sliding, basal erosion and friction loss in the conglomerate, seepage-driven pore pressure amplification, and micro-cracking propagation through concrete and underlying rock. These processes interacted nonlinearly, producing a latent but highly deterministic system trajectory toward collapse. Importantly, the apparent operational normalcy, surface stability, minor seepage, and limited cracking masked the seriousness of these mechanisms, creating a cognitive illusion of safety. Post-event forensic investigations confirmed that by late 1928, deformation had occurred along the eastern abutment foliation planes, with measurable rotational displacement of the concrete mass. The western abutment exhibited localized zones of internal piping and reduced basal friction. These observations validate the conclusion that failure processes were active well before the final collapse. The dam had entered a pre-failure regime characterized by multiple interacting stress paths, each insufficient alone to trigger collapse but collectively determinative of system instability. The interaction between hydromechanical processes, foundation heterogeneity, and procedural adherence underscores the importance of systems thinking in engineering forensics. The St. Francis Dam failure demonstrates that observable indicators, minor cracks, seepage flows, thermal contraction, cannot be interpreted in isolation. Each must be contextualized within the broader structural, geotechnical, and operational environment. In this case, conventional monitoring and procedural compliance provided a false sense of security, effectively allowing latent failure pathways to evolve unchecked. The forensic analysis also emphasizes the deterministic role of human decision-making within the operational framework. Operators acted logically given their observations and the prevailing engineering knowledge. Yet, authority-driven judgments, reliance on precedent, and cognitive bias limited consideration of alternative interpretations. The decision to continue incremental filling under observed minor anomalies, while procedurally justified, systematically reduced safety margins, creating a deterministic trajectory toward collapse. The human factor component was not a deviation from rationality, but a structured response to incomplete data filtered through established mental models. Finally, this period illustrates the importance of redundancy in both design and monitoring. Central drainage alone, visual inspection alone, and procedural adherence alone were insufficient to maintain system safety under asymmetric geotechnical conditions. Redundancy in monitoring, uplift measurement, deformation tracking, seepage quantification, combined with periodic reassessment of foundational assumptions, could have provided earlier detection of pre-failure conditions. In the absence of such redundancy, the system progressed toward collapse as a predictable outcome of interacting physical and procedural factors. By early 1928, the St. Francis Dam had entered a phase in which latent failure mechanisms were not only active, but increasingly interdependent. The prior chapters documented incremental filling, early seepage, surface cracking, and geotechnical asymmetries. In this chapter, the focus is on the acceleration of these mechanisms under operational conditions and the deterministic processes that govern system degradation during the final months leading up to collapse. The analysis integrates geotechnical behavior, hydrostatic loading, concrete mechanics, human decision-making, and procedural frameworks to provide a comprehensive understanding of the final pre-failure phase. Observational records from the period indicate that the reservoir was maintained near maximum operational levels for extended durations, particularly following seasonal rainfall events. Each incremental rise in water height increased hydrostatic pressure at the dam base and abutment interfaces. On the eastern side, the Pelona schist experienced cumulative stress along foliation planes, gradually decreasing frictional resistance and initiating slow rotational displacement of the adjacent concrete mass. Laboratory reconstructions and post-collapse measurements indicate that the effective shear strength of the schist was reduced by progressive saturation, with displacement magnitudes sufficient to alter load transfer paths within the concrete. On the western side, the Vasquez conglomerate underwent compaction and fine migration, producing localized erosion channels and reducing basal friction. These processes, though minor in magnitude individually, acted collectively to amplify asymmetrical stress distribution across the dam. The interaction of uplift pressures, abutment heterogeneity, and arch action in the gravity arch design was central to the system's vulnerability. The original design premise assumed a rigid abutment foundation capable of resisting lateral forces and transmitting uniform load. In reality, differential deformation along the eastern and western abutments introduced bending moments and torsional stresses that were not considered in the initial calculations. Tensile forces developed in mid-height sections of the dam, where concrete was structurally weaker and unreinforced, increasing the likelihood of crack propagation. Simultaneously, basal sliding tendencies intensified as uplift pressures exceeded frictional resistance in localized zones. The system had therefore transitioned from a quasi-static, stable configuration into a state in which multiple failure mechanisms were co-activated and mutually reinforcing. Instrumentation remained minimal, limiting operational awareness. Relief wells in the central section provided partial drainage and some indication of uplift, yet pressures beneath the abutments went unmeasured. Surface cracks and seepage flows, although recorded, were insufficient to diagnose the complex interactions occurring within the foundation. In effect, the observable indicators remained internally consistent with operator expectations while masking the progressive erosion of safety margins. This diagnostic gap illustrates a recurring theme in structural failures. Monitoring fidelity must align with the system's most critical failure modes. Otherwise, latent mechanisms can evolve undetected. Operational logs show repeated notations of seepage along the eastern abutment and minor turbidity in western flows. Each instance was categorized as non-critical based on precedent and prior experience. From a human factors perspective, this exemplifies confirmation bias. Observations were interpreted to fit established mental models rather than prompting independent verification. Authority structures reinforced this mindset. Mulholland's prior successes and dominant role in decision-making created a professional culture in which questioning design assumptions was discouraged. This systemic cognitive constraint limited the range of considered operational responses, effectively allowing latent failure pathways to evolve unchecked. Hydromechanical processes during this period were cumulative and time-dependent. Minor seepage through the conglomerate enlarged microfractures and transported fine particles, progressively reducing shear resistance at the base. On the eastern abutment, water infiltration along schist foliation planes increased pore pressures and promoted micro-rotational movement. The resulting asymmetry in stress distribution created torsional loading in the concrete mass, exacerbating mid-height tensile stresses. Thermal expansion and contraction cycles further propagated microcracks, providing additional conduits for water penetration. Collectively, these processes exemplify a positive feedback loop in which small, initially benign perturbations compounded over time, amplifying structural vulnerability. From a procedural standpoint, the operators adhered to incremental filling schedules and routine observation protocols. Each decision, considered in isolation, was rational given the data available and the engineering practices of the era. However, the procedural framework was optimized for a system operating under original assumptions, not for one experiencing evolving foundation heterogeneity and coupled failure modes. The deterministic nature of the failure pathway emerges from this misalignment. Technically sound decisions, applied within an inappropriate operational model, systematically reduced safety margins and accelerated progression toward collapse. Seepage dynamics illustrate this principle. Initial flows through the western conglomerate were minor and superficially consistent with expectations. Over time, the internal erosion of clay-rich layers facilitated preferential flow paths, creating localized zones of high hydraulic pressure and reduced basal friction. Simultaneously, rotational displacement in the eastern abutment increased bending moments in the dam's mid-height sections, concentrating tensile stress in regions of concrete with minimal resistance. The combination of these processes created a state in which the structure was both geometrically and materially predisposed to sudden failure, even though surface indicators remained superficially acceptable. Geotechnical coupling amplified the rate of degradation. Sliding tendencies in the eastern schist increased lateral stress on the concrete arch, which, in turn, transmitted additional shear to the western abutment. Localized basal erosion in the conglomerate allowed minor rotations that further increased stress on the eastern interface. These mutually reinforcing mechanisms exemplify how interacting failure modes can produce nonlinear escalation in system vulnerability. From a forensic perspective, recognizing these coupled processes is essential to understanding why collapse was inevitable once certain stress thresholds were crossed. Human and organizational factors continued to shape system response. Observed anomalies were filtered through the cognitive framework established by precedent and authority. Even when seepage or cracking exceeded prior observations, interpretations remained consistent with the expectation of operational normalcy. Corrective measures, such as additional drainage, excavation, or foundation reinforcement, were not considered because the existing mental model assumed competence of abutments and sufficiency of central drainage. This demonstrates the deterministic role of human cognition in reinforcing latent structural vulnerability, procedural adherence, and authority validation, while rational individually, collectively constrained the system's capacity for adaptive intervention. By this stage, the dam had effectively transitioned into a deterministic pre-failure state. Stress redistribution, coupled with hydromechanical processes and foundation heterogeneity, created a configuration in which incremental changes, minor increases in water level or transient seepage events, could trigger full-scale structural compromise. Post-event analysis confirmed that both abutments exhibited measurable deformation. The eastern schist had rotated along foliation planes, while the western conglomerate showed basal erosion and localized loss of friction. These findings indicate that the system had reached a tipping point. Observable stability persisted at the surface, yet internal stresses had exceeded the structural capacity of key elements. Redundancy, or the lack thereof, emerges as a critical theme in this phase. Central drainage, visual inspection, and procedural compliance taken together were insufficient to maintain structural integrity under asymmetric foundation conditions. The absence of internal instrumentation, such as piezometers or displacement gauges, prevented early detection of progressive failure mechanisms. Consequently, the deterministic pathway to collapse remained unobserved until the final event. This illustrates a fundamental principle in forensic engineering. Apparent operational normalcy can conceal critical vulnerabilities when monitoring systems are misaligned with the system's most significant failure modes. The cumulative effect of hydrostatic load, foundation heterogeneity, thermal cycling, and human decision-making demonstrates a system in which failure was both predictable and inevitable once assumptions were violated. Each incremental observation and operational decision, rational in isolation, contributed to the progressive erosion of safety margins. Coupled geotechnical mechanisms and positive feedback loops ensured that once the system entered a critical state, collapse would follow rapidly. Importantly, this trajectory was not apparent from surface indicators. Observable behavior remained consistent with operational expectations until the final stages. The deterministic nature of the final pre-failure phase also illustrates the importance of integrating human factors, procedural analysis, and physical system modeling. Operational confidence, authority structures, and reliance on precedent all interacted with geotechnical realities to produce a system in which technically rational decisions collectively ensured the progression toward collapse. From a forensic perspective, the lesson is clear. The interplay between human cognition, procedural frameworks, and complex material behavior can generate latent pathways to failure that remain invisible to conventional monitoring. In conclusion, the St. Francis Dam during this period exhibited all characteristics of a pre-failure system: asymmetrical deformation, coupled failure modes, cumulative hydromechanical stress, and superficial operational normalcy. Observed anomalies were internally consistent with expectations, yet underlying processes had eroded safety margins to the point where the factor of safety was approaching unity. Procedural adherence, authority-driven confidence, and limited monitoring contributed to deterministic progression toward collapse. This chapter underscores the convergence of technical, geotechnical, and human factors in driving structural failure and highlights the importance of comprehensive monitoring, redundancy, and critical reassessment of assumptions in complex engineered systems. By late 1928, the St. Francis Dam had entered the terminal stage of its operational life, characterized by the culmination of latent geotechnical processes, hydro-mechanical stress accumulation, and procedural decisions that collectively defined a deterministic pathway toward catastrophic failure. The preceding chapters established the critical context. Initial assumptions regarding uniform abutment competence, sufficiency of drainage, and predictable concrete behavior under hydrostatic loading were progressively invalidated by the heterogeneous foundation conditions, cumulative seepage, microcracking, and coupled deformation mechanisms. In this chapter, the forensic focus is on the immediate pre-collapse period, the dynamics of structural failure initiation, and the post-event evidence that confirms the deterministic nature of the collapse. The reservoir remained near full capacity in early March 1928, with operational logs indicating steady water levels following incremental adjustments. Each increment in head contributed additional hydrostatic pressure at the dam base and interfaces, particularly stressing the already compromised abutments. The eastern Pelona schist, now saturated along foliation planes and subhorizontal fractures, exhibited progressive rotational displacement of the adjacent concrete mass. Post-collapse analysis indicates rotations on the order of centimeters at the base, sufficient to alter stress transfer patterns and increase torsional moments along mid-height sections of the dam. On the western side, the Vasquez conglomerate experienced intensified basal erosion, with microchannels formed by seepage and fine migration reducing friction and further destabilizing the base. The result was a pronounced asymmetry in structural response, one abutment rotating and the other weakening in shear, creating conditions for progressive stress concentration. Instrumentation, limited to relief wells beneath the central dam section and occasional surface inspections, was inadequate to capture these processes. Uplift pressures beneath the abutments were unmonitored, while crack propagation and seepage flows, though recorded, offered only superficial indications of underlying instability. This lack of high-fidelity monitoring contributed directly to the inability of operators to detect the critical pre-failure state. Observed anomalies, minor seepage, superficial cracks, small increases in turbidity, were internally consistent with the mental model of operational normalcy, masking the fact that the system had entered a deterministic pre-failure regime. Hydromechanical interactions intensified as the reservoir remained full. Seepage through the western conglomerate expanded fissures and further reduced basal friction, while rotational movement in the eastern schist increased bending moments and torsional stress in the concrete mass. Thermal expansion and contraction cycles amplified crack propagation, providing additional pathways for water infiltration and pore pressure buildup. Each process, while individually modest, interacted synergistically with the others. The result was a nonlinear escalation in structural vulnerability, whereby minor perturbations could now trigger cascading failure. From an engineering perspective, the dam's gravity arch design relied on the weight of mass concrete and competent abutments to resist hydrostatic forces. In the absence of uniform abutment rigidity, the arch action became asymmetric, concentrating tensile forces in mid-height regions of the dam. These sections were unreinforced and lacked the structural capacity to accommodate the evolving stresses. Simultaneously, basal uplift on the western side approached the critical threshold for sliding, while the eastern side's rotational tendencies exceeded the shear resistance of the schist foliation planes. The system had reached a point at which any incremental increase in water pressure or further microdisplacement would trigger a rapid, self-propagating failure. Operational procedures and human factors played a critical role in defining this deterministic trajectory. Authority-driven confidence in prior engineering judgments and reliance on surface observations reinforced a false perception of stability. Minor anomalies were documented but systematically interpreted as non-critical, consistent with historical precedent. No extraordinary inspections or geotechnical assessments were conducted, and procedural adherence, rational within the framework of the time, effectively locked the system into a path of inevitable failure. This exemplifies the interaction between human cognition and complex systems. Technically sound decisions, when applied to a system in which foundational assumptions have been violated, can accelerate progression toward catastrophic collapse. The final hours before failure were marked by conditions that remained superficially consistent with operational expectations. Reservoir levels were steady, seepage rates had not visibly increased, and downstream cracks exhibited no sudden changes. Yet internally, the dam had crossed multiple thresholds. The factor of safety against basal sliding in the western conglomerate had dropped below unity. Rotational movement of the eastern abutment had reached a magnitude sufficient to redistribute stresses non-linearly, and tensile stresses in mid-height concrete sections exceeded allowable limits. The system was now in a metastable state, poised for rapid collapse upon the slightest perturbation. The collapse sequence, as reconstructed from post-event forensic analysis, began with failure at the eastern abutment. Micro-rotational movement along schist foliation planes initiated cracking at the interface between concrete and abutment rock, producing sudden stress redistribution. Tensile cracks propagated along mid-height sections, intersecting existing thermal and shrinkage fissures. Concurrently, basal erosion and loss of friction in the western conglomerate reduced resistance to sliding. These combined processes triggered a domino effect. The concrete mass rotated eastward, uplifted slightly on the western side, and ultimately fractured along its length. Within seconds, the gravity arch structure disintegrated, releasing the full reservoir volume downstream. Hydromechanical modeling confirms that the collapse was a deterministic outcome of the pre-failure state. The system's geometry, material properties, and load distribution created a configuration in which failure would occur once critical stress thresholds were exceeded. The absence of significant external triggers, no seismic event, no overtopping, underscores the deterministic nature. The failure was the result of intrinsic structural and geotechnical conditions, combined with procedural and human factors rather than random or extraordinary external forces. Post-collapse surveys revealed widespread destruction along the San Francisco Canyon. Downstream debris fields corresponded to the volume and mass of the disintegrated dam, with concrete blocks displaced according to predicted stress trajectories. Seepage channels and scoured conglomerate deposits corroborated the pre-failure erosion patterns identified in earlier forensic reconstructions. The eastern abutment exhibited displacement consistent with rotational failure, while the western abutment displayed basal sliding consistent with reduced friction from progressive piping. These observations validate the deterministic failure pathway inferred from operational and geotechnical analysis. The dam's collapse was not a matter of chance, but the logical conclusion of interacting physical and procedural factors. From a human factors perspective, the collapse illustrates the limitations of authority-driven decision-making and observation-dependent monitoring in complex engineered systems. Operators acted logically within the constraints of available information and prevailing engineering knowledge. Yet the cognitive framework, reinforced by precedent and institutional authority, systematically filtered observations and constrained adaptive responses. Minor anomalies were interpreted as non-critical, and procedural adherence prevented intervention strategies that could have altered the failure trajectory. This interplay between human cognition and system dynamics exemplifies a fundamental principle in forensic engineering. Technically, rational decisions can produce deterministic failure when underlying assumptions are invalidated. The deterministic progression also underscores the importance of redundancy in monitoring and design. Central drainage, visual inspections, and routine operational procedures, while technically appropriate for uniform, competent abutments, were insufficient to detect or mitigate failure mechanisms in heterogeneous saturated rock. The absence of internal instrumentation, such as piezometers or displacement gauges prevented early recognition of metastable conditions. The collapse demonstrates that operational normalcy, when assessed using insufficient monitoring frameworks, can mask the development of critical structural vulnerabilities. Finally, the St. Francis Dam failure provides a compelling example of the convergence of technical, geotechnical, and human factors in catastrophic structural failure. The interplay between asymmetric abutment properties, hydromechanical stress accumulation, coupled deformation mechanisms, and authority-driven procedural adherence created a deterministic pathway to collapse. Observed surface behavior, minor seepage, superficial cracks, steady reservoir levels remained consistent with operational expectations, masking the internal degradation that made failure inevitable. Post-event evidence confirms that the system reached a pre-failure state weeks prior to collapse, highlighting the latent nature of the failure mechanisms and the limitations of early 20th century engineering monitoring and procedural design. In conclusion, the collapse of the St. Francis Dam was the predictable outcome of interacting deterministic processes. Design assumptions regarding abutment competence, sufficiency of central drainage, and predictable concrete response were invalidated by heterogeneous foundation conditions. Progressive hydromechanical processes, microcracking, basal erosion, and coupled deformation mechanisms systematically eroded safety margins. Procedural adherence, reliance on surface observation, and authority-driven cognitive bias reinforced operational normalcy and prevented timely intervention. The ultimate failure was not triggered by an extraordinary event, but emerged from the natural evolution of a system operating beyond the limits of its design assumptions. A convergence of engineering, geotechnical, and human factors that produced a deterministic catastrophe.